In 1905, Louisiana was a state where industrial progress had not yet completely penetrated the most isolated corners. In the swamps around Shreveport, entire families lived in complete isolation, following traditions that dated back to the first French colonists. Some of these traditions, however, had become distorted in unimaginable ways over the generations. This is one of the most disturbing stories I've ever heard. A story about what can happen when extreme isolation combines with desperate survival needs. A story that shows how human beings can transform into something far worse than any fictional monster. In the outskirts of Shreveport, rumors began circulating about entire families that simply disappeared while traveling the rural roads toward the interior. Abandoned wagons, loose horses, but never a single body. It was as if the earth had swallowed these people without leaving a trace. What no one imagined was that, right in the heart of the swamps, a family had developed a terrible solution to food scarcity. A solution that would involve generations of secrets, blood, and a tradition that would challenge everything we know about human nature. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments. And if this is your first time on the channel, subscribe so you don't miss the next stories I have to tell. The Broussard family had lived for more than 60 years on an isolated property in the middle of the Louisiana swamps. The land, inherited from generation to generation, was almost a 2-hour ride from the nearest town, accessible only by muddy trails that became impassable during rains. It was the kind of place where a person could live and die without the outside world ever knowing of their existence. The Broussard clan was much larger than anyone in the region imagined. 14 people lived on that remote property, forming an isolated community that had developed its own rules and traditions over decades of complete isolation. The family structure was complex and disturbing, the result of generations of marriages between close relatives. Cléos Broussard, the 75-year-old matriarch, commanded the family with absolute authority. Small and bent with age, her eyes still gleamed with a cruel intelligence that made anyone feel uncomfortable in her presence. She always wore the same faded black dress and a shawl that smelled of smoke, and something else, something neighbors could never completely identify. Alcide Broussard, 42 years old, was the official patriarch of the family and Cléos's son. Tall and thin, with sunken eyes that always seemed suspicious of any stranger, he spoke little. When he did, it was always with a hoarse voice that sounded more like a growl than human words. His enormous hands bore scars from decades of handling improvised tools and work that no outsider could completely identify. Beside Alcide, his half-sister Cordelia Broussard, 38 years old, exercised almost equal influence in the family as Cléos's daughter by a different partner. She had grown up in the same tradition of isolation and inbreeding. Cordelia was responsible for organizing the work of the women and children, and her intimidating presence made everyone obey without question. She had the same sunken eyes as Alcide, but with a more refined cruelty, as if she had developed more subtle methods of control over the younger family members. Bogard and Magnolia Broussard, cousins aged 35 and 29 respectively, completed the adult core of the family. Bogard was a corpulent and silent man who rarely spoke, but whose sheer physical presence intimidated anyone who approached the property. Magnolia, in turn, demonstrated an almost fanatical devotion to Cléos, repeating her words and executing her orders with an obsessive precision. The older children formed an intermediate group in the family hierarchy. Ully, 25, was Alcide's daughter and occasionally appeared in the village to trade salted meat for supplies. Boudreau, 21, and also Alcide's son, frequently accompanied the family's hunting expeditions. Both spoke even less than the adults, limiting themselves to nodding and pointing to what they wanted to buy when they came to town. But it was the 7 children and adolescents who most caught the attention of those who occasionally saw them. Thibodeau, 16, and Celeste, 14, were the oldest of the group and demonstrated a disturbing maturity for their ages. They moved with adult confidence, yet maintained a childish obedience to the commands of their elders. The other 5 children, Octave, 12, Sidonie, 10, The twins Alcy and Anatole 8, and little Azeli, only 6, were rarely seen by strangers. When they did appear, they always remained grouped together, whispering among themselves in an archaic French dialect that even the oldest French descendants in the region could not completely understand. The Broussard property was a labyrinth of improvised construction scattered across several acres of swampy land. The main house, made of dark wood and covered by a rusty zinc roof, housed the adults and older children. Around it were scattered smaller cabins, sheds, an abandoned corral, and other structures that seemed to have been built without any planning, as if each generation had simply added what they needed. What most caught attention was the organized silence that reigned on the property. Even with 14 people living there, loud conversations or noisy activities were rarely heard. Work was executed in an almost religious silence, with each family member knowing their responsibilities exactly without the need for verbal instructions. During the winter of 1901, something changed in the Broussard family. According to later observations by Father Gilbert Horton, it was around this time that the family began to show signs of inexplicable prosperity. Their clothes, though simple, appeared to be in better condition. The children, who had previously seemed malnourished, began to show signs of more abundant feeding. From 1902, local merchants started to notice significant changes in the Broussard family's habits. Visits to town became more frequent and organized, with different family members appearing weekly to trade large quantities of salted meat for essential supplies. The amount of meat they brought to sell had increased dramatically, suggesting a much more abundant source of game than any isolated family should be able to obtain. Ali continued to be the main negotiator, appearing weekly with bags full of meat cut into uniform pieces, always well salted and wrapped in clean cloths. But now she was frequently accompanied by Magnolia, or some of the older adolescents, who carried additional quantities of meat and hides for sale. The local merchant, who most frequently negotiated with the family, began to question the origin of so much meat. The quantity was impressive for a family that apparently did not possess herds large enough to justify such production. When he asked about the source, he always received the same laconic response, "Swamp game." But the man, who had grown up in the region and knew all types of game available in the swamps, noticed that this meat had peculiar characteristics. It was lighter than deer meat, more tender than wild boar, and had a distinctive smell even after being salted, a smell he couldn't identify. But that made him feel vaguely nauseous every time he perceived it. The behavior of the Broussard children had also changed significantly since 1902. During visits to town, they demonstrated military discipline, always remaining in formation and never straying from the responsible adults. But there was something different in their eyes, a satisfaction that hadn't existed before, as if they had discovered something that made them deeply content. When one of them occasionally approached the counter where the merchant kept dried meat for sale, their behavior was always the same. They would smell the meat intensely and prolongedly, like animals identifying prey. But now there was a subtle difference. They seemed to be comparing that meat with something they knew well, and they always seemed disappointed with what they found. Father Gilbert Horton, the priest responsible for the small wooden church in the region, had tried several times to visit the Broussard family to offer religious services. All of his attempts were met with polite but firm refusals, always from Alcide, who would appear at the property entrance to block any approach. During these brief conversations, the priest noticed a constant movement in the shadows behind Alcide. Figures moved between the sheds and cabins, watching the conversation from a distance. It was as if the entire family was constantly alert, ready to hide or flee at the slightest sign of danger. The priest managed to count at least 12 different people watching from afar during a single visit. The Broussard family structure was so complex that not even they seemed to have complete clarity about the relationships. Generations of marriages between siblings, cousins, and even between parents and children had created a kinship network where traditional distinctions had become irrelevant. Alcide was simultaneously a father, uncle, and cousin to several children, while Cordelia was a sister aunt and mother to different family members. This prolonged inbreeding had resulted in children with subtle but perceptible deformities, facial asymmetries, dental problems, speech difficulties, and, more worryingly, visibly diminished mental capacities. The children demonstrated absolute obedience to adults, especially to Cleos, who exercised almost hypnotic control over all younger members. During the winter months, when roads became more difficult to travel, the Broussard family practically disappeared from public view. With 14 people to feed and no obvious source of income besides meat sales, periods of complete isolation raised questions about how they managed to survive so well. It was during these periods that the strangest rumors circulated among local residents. People reported strange lights seen in the distance toward the property, inexplicable smells carried by the wind on certain nights, and sounds that didn't seem completely human echoing through the swamps. Some hunters reported seeing figures moving in groups through the dense vegetation, always at a distance and always disappearing before they could be clearly identified. The family had developed a highly organized work system where each member had specific responsibilities based on age and ability. Adults handled the heaviest activities and important decisions. Adolescents served as assistants and messengers. The younger children were responsible for simple but essential tasks for the community's functioning. But there was something fundamentally disturbing about how this organization worked. It wasn't the normal structure of a working rural family, but something more like a military operation, or perhaps, more appropriately, like a criminal organization where each member knew their role exactly without the need for explanations. From 1902, attentive observers noticed that the family seemed to have developed specific schedules for different activities. There were periods when the entire property became completely silent, as if all residents had disappeared. These periods were always followed by days of intense activity, with constant movement between sheds and smoke, coming from several chimneys simultaneously. The first family to disappear was the Morrisons in March 1902. James Morrison, his wife Sarah, and their 3 small children were traveling from Shreveport to a small agricultural community in the interior where James had gotten work at a sawmill. They departed on a Monday morning with a wagon loaded with their few belongings and provisions for the 2-day journey. The wagon was found 3 days later by a group of lumberjacks, abandoned in a clearing about 5 kilometers from the Broussard property. The horses had been released and were wandering the area, still with their harnesses, but visibly nervous and frightened. Inside the wagon, all the family's belongings remained untouched: clothes, tools, even a small amount of money that James carried for emergencies. What most intrigued the authorities was the complete absence of signs of a struggle. There was no blood in the wagon, no marks of violence, not even footprints indicating where the family had gone. It was as if 5 people had simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only their belongings and 2 terrified horses. Sheriff Augustus Landry, an experienced man who had dealt with all kinds of crime in the region, was genuinely perplexed. In his 20 years of a career, he had seen murders, robberies, and kidnappings, but never anything like this. According to his official notes, it was as if the family had been taken by ghosts, an observation that would prove ironically close to the truth. Just 2 weeks later, it was the Thibodeau family's turn. Pierre Thibodeau, a merchant from New Orleans, was traveling with his wife Marie and their teenage daughter Amélie to visit relatives in the interior. They also disappeared without a trace, and their wagon was found in the same conditions, abandoned with all belongings untouched, but without any sign of the occupants. The pattern was established quickly and terrifyingly. During the rest of 1902, 6 more families disappeared, following exactly the same pattern. They were always families traveling alone on rural roads. Their wagons were always found abandoned in the same region. And there was always a total absence of clues about the fate of the disappeared. The local community began to enter a state of real panic. In 1903, the situation became even more desperate. 12 families disappeared throughout the year, an average of 1 family per month. Fear in the region had become palpable, and many merchants completely refused to travel on rural roads, preferring to make enormous detours or simply cancel their trips. It was during this period of growing terror that Father Gilbert Horton began to notice disturbing details about the Broussard family. During his pastoral visits, Father Gilbert Horton had observed that the number of people on the property seemed to vary inexplicably. Sometimes he saw many figures moving between the buildings, and at other times the property seemed almost deserted. Even more disturbing was the behavior of the children when they occasionally appeared in the village. They moved as a group, always under rigorous adult supervision, and demonstrated a discipline that was far beyond normal for children their ages. It was as if they had been trained for specific behaviors in public, hiding their true nature behind a carefully constructed facade. In his personal notes, the priest recorded his observations. The Broussard family continues to intrigue and disturb me. During my last visit attempt, I could observe at least 12 different people moving around the property, including several children who demonstrate a vitality they didn't possess before. The physical resemblance among all of them remains disturbing. But now there's something more, a satisfaction, almost a joy, that didn't exist in previous years. The priest also noticed that the children had a completely transformed relationship with food, especially meat. When they came to town, they approached the local butcher shop with a confidence he described as intimate knowledge. It was no longer simple curiosity, but something that suggested a deep and personal experience. The local merchant reported to the priest several incidents that had left him deeply uncomfortable. The Broussard children now smelled meat with the precision of experts, and when they thought no one was looking, some of them made comments in French that, even without being completely understood, sounded like technical evaluations about quality and preparation. During 1904, the pattern of disappearances continued with terrifying regularity. 10 more families vanished, always following the same method. The local population had organized into travel groups. No one risked traveling alone anymore, and many rural roads were practically abandoned. It was during this year that the priest began to notice a disturbing correlation. Whenever a family disappeared, the Broussard property became completely silent for 2 or 3 days, as if all residents had vanished. When activity resumed, there was always intense movement between the sheds, smoke coming from several chimneys, and a distinctive smell that the wind sometimes carried to nearby roads. The local merchant, when questioned by the priest about these observations, confirmed an even more disturbing pattern. According to him, after each period of silence on the property, the family appeared in town with exceptionally large quantities of salted meat to sell. The meat always had the same strange appearance and the same peculiar smell, but now there was much more of it. Even more worrying was the behavior of the children during these post-disappearance visits. They seemed more animated and alert, as if they had been very well fed after a period of fasting. Some of them demonstrated an almost manic energy, contrasting with the lethargy they normally exhibited. During the first half of 1905, 6 more families disappeared, maintaining the terrifying pattern that had been established. By this time, the region around Shreveport was in a state of total panic. Entire families had abandoned their rural properties to move to the city, and commerce between communities had practically ceased. Father Gilbert Horton, observing the pattern of disappearances and the increasingly suspicious behavior of the Broussard family, decided it was time for a deeper investigation. During the summer of 1905, he began taking regular walks through the region, paying special attention to the surroundings of the Broussard property. It was during one of these walks in August that he made a discovery that would change everything. Walking along a trail about a kilometer from the property, the priest noticed a strange smell in the air. It wasn't the normal smell of decomposition one would expect to find in a swamp, but something different, sweeter, and, at the same time, more nauseating. Following the smell, he arrived at an area where intense summer rains had washed away part of the soft soil, exposing what had been buried superficially. What he found made him question everything he thought he knew about human nature. Pieces of fabric that clearly belonged to human clothing emerged from the soaked earth. They weren't old rags or discarded clothes, but torn pieces of dresses, shirts, and pants that seemed to have been violently ripped off. There were shoes of different sizes, including small children's shoes, some still with socks inside. Carefully digging around the objects, the priest found more disturbing evidence: coat buttons, belt buckles, simple jewelry, children's toys, and even some human teeth mixed with the earth. The quantity of objects suggested that this location had been used as a deposit for the remains of multiple people over a considerable period. That night, Father Gilbert Horton wrote in his diary, "I found today evidence that confirms my worst fears about the fate of the disappeared families. The quantity of personal objects buried near the Broussard property, combined with the family's transformed behavior and the temporal pattern of disappearances, leads me to a conclusion that my Christian mind refuses to completely accept." During the following weeks, the priest continued his discreet investigations. He mapped the locations where the abandoned wagons had been found and realized that all were within a few kilometers of the Broussard property. More significantly, all disappearances had occurred on roads that passed near trails leading directly to the family's territory. The priest also began timing the family's activity patterns. He confirmed that whenever a family disappeared, the Broussard property became completely silent for 2 to 3 days. On the 4th day, activity resumed with intensity, and on the 5th or 6th day, family members appeared in town with large quantities of meat to sell. The local merchant, when presented with this chronology by the priest, was visibly shaken. According to the man, the pattern was so precise that he had unconsciously begun expecting visits from the Broussard family a few days after hearing about each disappearance. The regularity was too disturbing to be coincidence. Even more worrying was the quality of the meat the family brought. According to the merchant, it had improved significantly since 1902. It was better cut, better preserved, and prepared with a technique that suggested considerable experience. It was as if whoever processed it had perfected their methods through constant practice. Subscribe to the channel, because the story I'm about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine about the limits of human depravity. Father Gilbert Horton spent weeks tormented by what he had found. The evidence he had discovered in the area near the Broussard property kept him awake at night, praying and trying to find an explanation that didn't involve the horrors his mind was beginning to form. Finally, in September 1905, he made the decision that would change everything. He sought out Sheriff Augustus Landry. The conversation between the priest and the sheriff. It took place on a hot September afternoon in the improvised office that Landry maintained in a back room of the Shreveport City Hall. The priest arrived visibly shaken, carrying a leather bag where he had stored some of the evidence he had found. Pieces of fabric, buttons, shoes of different sizes, children's toys, and a small rag doll that still haunted him. According to official investigation records, the priest reported his discoveries in detail, including his observations about the abnormally large number of people living on the property, the excessive physical similarities among the children, the family's transformed behavior since 1902, and mainly the precise temporal correlation between disappearances and the Broussard family's activities. Landry, a practical man who had learned to trust the priest's instincts over the years, carefully examined each item that Gilbert had brought. The rag doll in particular caught his attention. It was a simple doll, the type that working families made for their daughters, but it was stained with something dark that appeared to be old blood. What most disturbed him was recognizing the fabric used to make the doll. It was identical to the dress that little Amélie Thibodeau wore when her family disappeared in 1902. Landry decided it was time for an immediate official investigation. The next day, he organized a search group composed of 8 deputies and 4 tracking dogs borrowed from local farmers. The objective was to conduct a systematic search in the area around the Broussard property, looking for more evidence, or in the worst case, the bodies of the 42 people who had disappeared in the last 4 years. The search began in the area where the priest had made his discoveries. The dogs immediately became agitated, barking and digging at several different points. In less than 2 hours, the team had discovered an area much larger than the priest had initially imagined. The soft swamp soil had preserved hundreds of personal objects scattered across an area of almost an acre. Shoes of all sizes, from men's boots to small children's shoes, emerged from the earth in different stages of decomposition. Pieces of dresses, shirts, pants, and underwear were scattered throughout the area, many torn in ways that suggested extreme violence. There were also personal objects: wedding rings, pocket watches, combs, broken glasses, children's toys, and even family Bibles. But it was when they began digging deeper that they made the discovery that would confirm their worst fears. About half a meter deep, the deputies found bones. Many bones, human bones of different sizes, including bones clearly belonging to small children, were mixed with animal bones in an obvious attempt to disguise the true nature of what was buried there. Dr. Rodney Manning, the local doctor who also served as coroner when necessary, was called to examine the remains. His initial analysis, recorded in the official investigation files, confirmed that there were bones from at least 22 different people buried in that first area. What most disturbed him was the systematic way the bones had been treated. Many showed precise cut marks, as if the flesh had been removed by someone with considerable butchering experience. According to the medical report, the bones had been processed in a way that Dr. Manning described as professional and efficient butchering. The cut marks were consistent and precise, suggesting that whoever had done the work had not only experience but also adequate tools for processing large quantities of human meat. The revelation hit the investigation team like a shock. Landry, despite all his experience, recorded in his reports that he felt physically nauseated upon fully understanding what they were facing. It wasn't just mass murder, but an industrial cannibalism operation that had functioned with terrifying efficiency for 4 years without detection. The decision was made immediately. It was time to confront the Broussard family directly. The next day, Landry organized an operation with 15 armed men to approach the property. They knew they were dealing with at least 14 dangerous people, including several adults who had participated in the murder of 42 people. The Broussard property, seen up close and with investigative eyes, proved even more disturbing than anyone had imagined. What from a distance appeared to be just a poorly maintained farm was actually a complex, carefully organized, to conceal and facilitate horrible activities on an industrial scale. The first shed they investigated contained what could only be described as an improvised industrial slaughterhouse. There were multiple wooden tables stained with old blood, knives of different sizes adapted from agricultural tools, bone saws, and dozens of metal hooks hanging from the ceiling. The smell in the place was unbearable, a mixture of dried blood, decomposition, and something sweet and nauseating that none of the men could identify. According to investigation reports, the shed was organized like a highly efficient production line. There were specific areas for different stages of the process: an area for initial slaughter, another for skin removal, a third for cutting and separating meat by type and quality, and finally, an area for preservation and storage. It was clear that the operation had been refined over years of constant practice. A second shed contained preservation equipment on an impressive scale. More than 50 wooden barrels full of salt, extensive shelves for drying meat, and even a sophisticated area for smoking. The amount of equipment suggested that the family processed much more meat than they could consume, confirming suspicions that they sold a significant portion of their production as legitimate game meat. A third shed revealed something even more shocking: a storage area organized like a commercial warehouse. There were shelves categorized by meat type, victim age, and preparation method. Improvised labels in French identified different products, and there was even a rotation system to ensure that older meat was used first. But it was in the back of the property that they made the most shocking discovery. A series of 6 large pits dug in the soft swamp soil contained a grotesque mixture of human and animal bones. The pits were systematically organized, with the oldest already completely filled and new ones being dug as needed. Dr. Manning. Examining the pits, estimated they contained the remains of the other 20 people who had disappeared. The organization suggested that the family had operated their cannibalism system with industrial efficiency, processing an average of more than 10 people per year during the last 4 years. The police operation had arrived at a crucial moment. When the officers approached the main house, they could hear agitated voices coming from inside, speaking in that archaic French dialect that characterized the family. There was frantic movement between the sheds and cabins, as if the entire family was trying to hide evidence or prepare a coordinated escape. Landry positioned his men around the entire property before announcing himself. He knew he was dealing with 14 people who had participated in the murder and processing of 42 victims and had no intention of giving them any opportunity to escape or organize resistance, according to official records. When the sheriff identified himself and ordered everyone to come out of the buildings, the response came in the form of total chaos. Figures ran in all directions, voices shouted in French, and it became clear that the family had prepared escape routes through the swamps. The deputies managed to intercept some, but others disappeared into the dense vegetation with the efficiency of those who knew every trail and hiding place in the region. When the confusion finally calmed down, the officers had captured only part of the family: Cleos, the elderly matriarch, Cordelia, and 5 of the younger children, Octave, Sidonie, the twins Alcy and Anatole, and little Azélie. 7 family members had managed to escape to the swamps: Alst, Uli, Boudreau, Bogart, Magnolia, Thibodeau, and Celeste. The complete investigation of the property revealed even more disturbing evidence. Besides the improvised slaughterhouses and bone pits, investigators found personal objects that clearly belonged to the disappeared families, organized as trophies. There was an entire cabin dedicated to storing clothes, jewelry, tools, and toys from the victims, some being used by the Broussard family as if they were their own. Even more shocking was the discovery of detailed records kept by Cleos. Written in archaic French, the notebooks documented each family attacked over the 4 years, including descriptions of the number of victims, the quality of meat obtained, specific preparation methods, and even evaluations of which family members provided the best meat. It was like a macabre library of cannibal recipes, developed and refined with scientific precision. In the main house, investigators found evidence that the children had been systematically trained to participate in all family activities. There were children's drawings depicting hunting and meat processing scenes that were clearly human, toys made from worked human bones, and even an improvised manual teaching children to identify different types of human meat. Dr. Manning, in his final report on the property investigation, concluded that the Broussard family had operated the most organized and efficient cannibalism system ever documented. The scale of the operation, involving 14 people working in perfect coordination to process more than 10 victims per year, had allowed them to operate as a true human meat industry. The arrest of Cleos Broussard, Cordelia, and the 5 children marked the beginning of the most disturbing phase of the entire investigation. Sheriff Landry had prepared several rooms in the jail for interrogations, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the revelations that were to come from such a complex and systematized family operation. Cleos, despite her 75 years, demonstrated a lucidity and coldness that chilled the blood. According to interrogation records, she sat in the wooden chair in the room with an expression that mixed contempt and a strange superiority, as if the officers were children asking foolish questions about matters they couldn't understand. Her first statements, recorded in official files, immediately revealed the distorted mentality that had developed in the family over generations. According to Cleos, they had done nothing wrong. They had simply perfected their ancestral traditions to meet the needs of a large family. She expressed genuine confusion about why their actions were considered criminal, repeatedly comparing them to the work of butchers and farmers. Cordelia, 38 years old, demonstrated fanatical loyalty to her mother and family traditions. During her interrogations, she confirmed all the details provided by Cleos, but with even more disturbing coldness and technical pride in the methods they had developed. According to official records, Cordelia spoke about the murders and processing of human meat with the same naturalness and precision that a chef would discuss complex recipes. Dr. Rodney Manning, who had been called to examine the 5 captured children, made discoveries that confirmed the worst suspicions about the effects of the family environment. The children, Octave 12 years old, Sidonia Stin, the twins Alcy and Anatol 8 years old, and little Azalee only 6, showed clear signs of generations of inbreeding, foot deformities, asymmetrical jaws, irregular dentition, and evident delays in cognitive development. Even more disturbing was their behavior. According to medical reports, they demonstrated intense fear of anyone outside the family, but absolute obedience to any order from Cleos or Cordelia. When one of the 2 women spoke, even in whispers, all the children immediately stopped what they were doing and paid total attention, like well-trained soldiers receiving orders from their commanders. During the first formal interrogations, Landry tried a careful approach with the older children. According to his official reports, Sheriff Landry's understanding of normal child development and family structures was challenged by what he discovered. When questioned about kinship, Octave identified Alced as his father, Cordelia as his mother, but also referred to Cleos as his grandmother and mother, and Magnolia as his aunt and sister. Each child had multiple fathers and mothers, depending on which line of kinship was followed. Later investigations revealed the disturbing truth about the Broussard family structure. Through conversations with Cleos and observation of the children, it became clear that the family had practiced systematic inbreeding for at least 4 generations. Alced was simultaneously father, uncle, cousin, and half-brother to several children, depending on which relationship was considered. Cleos, when she finally decided to speak about the family structure, revealed this information with a naturalness that shocked everyone present. According to her recorded statements, the family had always maintained pure blood, not allowing strangers to marry family members or family members to marry outside the clan. The result was a lineage where traditional family distinctions had become completely irrelevant. Dr. Manning, examining the improvised family records they found in the house, managed to trace at least 4 generations of marriages between siblings, cousins, uncles and nieces, and even between parents and children. The result was a genetically devastated lineage where physical and mental deformities had become the norm, instead of the exception. But it was when the interrogation turned to the family disappearances that the revelations became truly horrible. Cleos, perhaps realizing there was nothing left to hide, began to speak about the hunts with a frankness and technical pride that left investigators nauseated. According to her recorded statements, the operation had been developed and perfected over the previous 4 years. In 1902, according to Cleos, the family had decided it was time to expand their food sources to adequately sustain 14 people. What had begun as necessity had transformed into a highly organized and efficient operation. The operation was divided into specific phases, each with clearly defined responsibilities. Families traveling alone were first identified and observed by the younger family members who served as scouts. Thibodeau and Celeste, in particular, specialized in approaching traveling families by pretending to be lost or needy children. When a suitable family was located, preferably with several children, as according to Cleos, they provided more tender meat, Alced, Bogart and the older children approached, offering help, directions, or simply rural hospitality. The approach process was carefully planned to inspire total confidence. The Broussards presented themselves as a hospitable rural family, offering water for the horses, food for the children, or simply friendly conversation to break the monotony of travel. City people, according to Cleos, always trusted country people, especially when children were involved. It was a trust they had learned to exploit with surgical precision. The attack itself was quick, coordinated, and lethal. According to the confessions, different family members had specific roles. Some distracted the victims with conversation, others positioned themselves strategically around the wagon. And when Cleos gave the signal, all was she who decided the exact moment, the entire family attacked simultaneously. The victims were killed quickly, usually with precise blows to the head, using heavy hammers to avoid screams and unnecessary suffering. Cleos made a point of emphasizing that they weren't sadistic, just practical. A quick death was a matter of efficiency, and, in her distorted mind, even compassion. The transportation and processing process, as described in the statements, revealed the impressive level of organization of the operation. The bodies were loaded in covered wagons that the family maintained specifically for this purpose, while the victims' wagons were abandoned in strategic locations to confuse authorities. All processing was done in the sheds that investigators had discovered, with each family member having specific responsibilities based on age and skill. The youngest children helped with simple tasks like cleaning, while adolescents assisted in cutting and separation. Adults handled the more technical and heavy work. The phrase that would become the symbol of the Broussard family's depravity was recorded during these interrogations. Meat is meat, family is family, and business is business. According to Cleos, the Broussard family had transformed a survival necessity into an efficient commercial operation that sustained them. Cordelia provided specific technical details about their methods, explaining they had different processes for adults and children, and even for different body parts. This macabre science was developed and refined through years of practice. The preservation and distribution system was equally organized. Some meat was consumed fresh by the family, some was salted and stored, and a significant portion, about half, was prepared for sale in town. Cordelia claimed they had learned to season and prepare human meat to make it not only indistinguishable from game, but also superior in flavor and texture. When questioned separately, the Broussard children confirmed the adults' accounts with a chilling naturalness. For them, cannibalism was not an aberration, but a normal part of life. They had grown up participating in all aspects of the operation, from identifying victims to processing meat, and considered it as routine as other children helping with a harvest. According to interrogation records, Sidoni stated that they had always eaten that way, but that the food had improved greatly in the last 4 years. She mentioned that Cleos taught them it was better than butcher shop meat, because they knew exactly where it came from and could choose the best pieces. Octave, when asked if he knew they were eating people, responded with a distorted logic that revealed how deeply the family had disconnected from normal morality. He expressed genuine confusion, arguing that people were animals. 2, that everyone was made of the same meat, and that they had simply found a better and more reliable source of food. Dr. Manning, trying to understand the children's mental state, discovered that they had developed specific and sophisticated preferences. Octave preferred meat from young adults. Sidoni had a preference for children her own age, and the twins had developed specific tastes based on the victim's gender. The children discussed these preferences with the same naturalness that other children would discuss their favorite foods, sharing opinions on preparation methods, seasonings, and even which families had provided the best meat. The investigation into the Broussard family revealed that they had killed and consumed exactly 42 people over 4 years, averaging more than 10 victims per year. The victims' bodies were processed and either consumed by the family or sold, while their belongings were kept as trophies or sold. Cleos Broussard, the matriarch, showed no remorse and was proud of her actions, comparing them to the success of a prosperous farm. She explained that the family had transformed a sporadic tradition into a systematic and profitable operation in 1902 to sustain their large family. Cleos revealed that the practice began with her grandfather, who during a harsh winter consumed a traveler who died of natural causes. This isolated incident evolved into an occasional family tradition. However, in 1902, Cleos had the vision to turn this practice into a full-scale, profitable operation. With 14 family members to feed and limited resources, she realized that rural roads provided a constant and renewable source of food and income. Cleos described the operation's development with the pride of a successful entrepreneur. They started with rudimentary methods in 1902, but quickly perfected their techniques, achieving what she called operational perfection by 1904 and 1905. The operation was a highly specialized, family-wide effort with each member having a specific role. Alst and Bogard, specialists in approaching and eliminating victims. Ully and Magnolia, responsible for initial processing. Boudreau, specialized in preservation and preparation for sale. Thibodeau, expert at identifying vulnerable families. Celeste, specialized in gaining. Children's Trust, these twins, Alce and Anatole, responsible for cleaning bones. Sidoni helped separate the meat by quality, and even little Azalie had age-appropriate tasks. The family developed a sophisticated system for categorizing meat based on the victim's age, sex, physical condition, and occupation. They also had different preparation methods for different types of customers. The financial operation was equally organized, generating enough income to buy supplies and reinvest in their business. Cleos had plans to expand the operation by establishing branches in other parts of Louisiana. The family saw their actions not as crimes, but as an innovative and efficient way of life. The trial became one of Louisiana's most disturbing and complex cases. The courthouse in Shreveport was packed with journalists and relatives of the victims. Cleos Broussard, as the matriarch and leader, was the main focus. At 75, she listened to the charges, 42 premeditated murders, systematic cannibalism, and more, with an expression of boredom as if they were discussing trivial business matters. Cordelia, tried as a principal accomplice, demonstrated the same coldness as her mother, but with added arrogance. During her testimony, she not only confirmed the crimes, but corrected the prosecutor on technical aspects of human meat. Processing, the prosecutor later admitted that the complete lack of remorse was the most disturbing aspect of the case. He felt like he was judging people from a different species with an alien moral system. During her testimony, Cleos maintained her stance of explaining a successful business to people who couldn't understand her genius. She expressed frustration with the court's ignorance about survival and operational efficiency. Official records show Cleos Broussard repeatedly justified her actions as a necessary and intelligent solution for a large family's survival in isolation. She and her family, she argued, had simply found an innovative and efficient way to deal with their limited resources. When asked if she felt remorse for the 42 people they had killed, including 16 children, she responded that she saw no difference between her actions and a farmer killing cattle for food and income. The 5 captured children, Octave, Sidoni, Alce, Anatole, and Azalie, presented a complex legal and moral dilemma. While they were victims of a highly dysfunctional family, they had also actively participated in the crimes. Dr. Rodney Manning's report to the court stated that the children suffered severe psychological damage from inbreeding and systematic conditioning, lacking the moral development to understand their actions. The court decided to send the children to separate religious orphanages in various cities. The goal was to correct them through intensive moral and religious education. Though the outcome was uncertain, Octave and Sidoni showed some capacity to adapt, but struggled to understand why their family work was wrong. Alce and Anatole had greater difficulty adapting, exhibiting aggressive behaviors when forced to eat only animal meat. Azalie, being the youngest, showed the most progress. She was less exposed to the family's extreme practices and, after years of education, developed a better understanding of normal social behaviors. Cleos Broussard was sentenced to death by hanging. She maintained her cold, superior demeanor until the end, predicting that others would eventually adopt her methods. Cordelia received a life sentence, but died 2 years later, reportedly from a lung infection. She refused to eat anything but bread and vegetables, choosing to die malnourished rather than consume animal meat. The search for the 7 fugitives, Alst, Ully, Boudreau, Bogard, Magnolia, Thibodeau, and Celeste continued for months. The Louisiana swamps provided countless hiding places, and the family's knowledge of the terrain made them difficult to track. In March 1906, lumberjacks found a fire pit on a swamp island with human bones that Dr. Manning identified as belonging to the fugitives. The final discovery suggested that the Broussard family's tradition of cannibalism had come full circle. Unable to find new victims and isolated in the deep swamp, they had likely turned on each other for survival. It was a gruesome end that served as a final macabre testament to their twisted beliefs. The analysis suggested at least 3 people had been killed and consumed at that location, but it was unclear if the victims were strangers or members of the family. Dr. Manning speculated that the isolated Broussard fugitives, lacking other food sources, had turned on each other. The search for the remaining 7 family members was eventually called off. The most widely accepted theory is that the family's hierarchy collapsed without Kleos to maintain order, leading to fatal internal violence. In March 1906, bones identified as human were found at an improvised fire pit, suggesting a gruesome end for at least some of the fugitives. The last confirmed evidence of their presence came in August 1906, when bloodied clothes belonging to Ole and Magnolia were found, suggesting a violent struggle. Sheriff Landry concluded that the fugitives likely hadn't survived the first winter in the swamps. The Broussard property was burned by authorities in September 1906. The fire, fueled by the structure's wood and animal fat-impregnated soil, burned for 5 days. Even after the fire, the area remained avoided by locals, who reported an atmosphere of unease. Floods in 1907 and 1908 continued to unearth bone fragments and personal objects, as if the earth itself refused to keep the secrets buried. The Broussard children's lives were tragic and varied. Octave died at 19 from an infection, still asking to return to the family work. Sidonie lived to 23, but never adapted to a normal life, often displaying aggressive behavior and trying to get other children to eat raw meat. The twins, Elsie and Anatole, were separated due to violent incidents and died young in institutions. Only Azalea achieved a semblance of a normal life. Adopted at 13 under a new identity, she married and had children but never spoke of her past. She died at 55, taking her secrets to the grave. The Broussard case had a lasting impact, shaking trust in rural hospitality and prompting changes in law enforcement. Father Gilbert Horton, Dr. Manning, and Sheriff Landry were all deeply affected by the case, which fundamentally changed their views on human nature. The story is haunting, not for supernatural elements, but for its complete lack of them. It was a case of human beings who, through extreme isolation, inbreeding, and a distorted mentality, transformed into an efficient, industrial cannibalism operation. The case serves as a somber reminder of how quickly civilization can devolve into barbarism when moral checks are removed. It raises profound questions about the nature of morality and the human capacity for organization and perfection, even in the most abominable practices.